Everyone is here. What would you have? Love and beauty? Strength? Courage? Deception? Mystery? Vice? And look here, see who's just come. It's our old enemy, Death, who always comes sooner or later. Death has come. I doubted you these past 2 days, old friend. I ought to have known better. And who is it he has brought with him? Innocence, I believe it is. Yes, it's innocence. Now everyone is here. The show will begin in a moment or two. Not for the faint of heart. You have never seen anything like it. Anything at all. Everyone is here now. A 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. Short is the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. Confusing, dense, inaccessible, weird, cerebral, ingenious. Whenever you hear someone talk about the Book of the New Sun, words like these come up. There's a sense of being confused and of something very special happening. My name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books, and yes, today we're talking about Gene Wolfe's The Shadow of the Torturer, the first of 4 books for the Book of the New Sun. But I should mention first that this video is in part a response, a sort of companion video to Chris at Liminal Spaces and the 2 videos that he made on Shadow of the Torturer. I have never, even though this is my absolute favorite series, I've never read any critical analysis of Gene Wolfe's works, especially this series. Chris's review video is maybe the only thing I've ever seen that somebody did that actually talks in full about the book. Chris's videos were excellent. I really highly recommend them. This is in part a companion video, but it also has to exist in its own space and still be viable. So there could be some ground that we retread. I'm definitely going to reference a few things that Chris said because I really liked the attention he put on some things, and in general, love his stuff. The story follows Severian, who is an apprentice in the Order of Seekers for Truth and Penitence, namely the Torturers Guild. We see him go from an apprentice to a journeyman, and then make a decision which ultimately ends in his exile from the guild. I'll start with a bold statement. The Book of the New Sun, of which Shadow of the Torturer is the first volume, is a game.
This is for you. You should. What do you get for the man who has everything? I think you'll like this. I did. That was the best thing that ever happened to me.
But before I explain myself, I want to talk about who this video is for. For someone who's read this book and is confused or uncertain about some of the themes or the imagery, I hope that this will sort of maybe not exactly expressly define those symbols, but to give you a path to deciding for yourself what they mean. For someone who's experienced, who's read this book multiple times and feel that they've really plumbed the depths, I hope to provide entertainment and to perhaps allow you a new perspective that maybe you hadn't thought of. We're going to keep our fingers crossed on that one. I do have a few pieces of advice for someone who's new, who hasn't read the book. I'm editing this video now and watching myself, which is never fun, talk about this book and really feel as though I didn't explain something quite the way I'd like to, or define a term that's kind of important the way I really feel it should be defined, and really debated putting new B-roll in or re-recording a new voiceover, something, and I decided not to do that. I think this video is really a conversation, an evolving conversation, and this earlier iteration of that conversation that I'm trying to have is just that. It's not 100% accurate, but it's in the spirit of what I'm trying to say, and I think as the conversation continues, it will evolve and be refined. And part of that is just leaving this, warts and all, as it were. So I only ask that you're generous with me and my interpretations and discussion, and just knowing that it evolves and that that I want to talk about this book, that I like talking about it, that this isn't a perfect discussion, but it was never meant to be. Thanks. First, the book is not a bunch of melancholic musings about torture and death. It doesn't feature torture as a main element of the story. It's not gory. It doesn't dwell on those things. The worst is there's a very brief, very clinical description of an application applied to a client, as they call them in the book. You don't have to worry about it being very graphic or depressing. Though it's a book about a torturer, there's basically zero torture. The second is engage with the book the way that you want to, the way that you are most comfortable. Some people will tell you they take a bunch of notes and do this other stuff. If that's what you do, do it. If you don't do that, don't. Because if you feel pressured to do that, it's going to mess up the experience of reading the book. And it's a great book. It's a fun book to read. The last thing I would want to do, or anybody else should want to do, is to ruin that experience for you. Enjoy it. Enjoy the experience. The book was designed and written to be reread. I do not think it's possible to read this book a single time and come away saying, got it. I just don't think it's possible. I mean, there may be some superhuman out there who can do it. Kudos to you, man. Whatever. But it isn't me, and it probably isn't you either, so don't sweat it. Look up the stuff that you want to look up. Don't look up the other stuff you don't have the energy to do. Just do whatever. When you go back for another read, you'll probably want to start doing that. And I'll say that the experience of doing that is significantly different than it was when the book was written in the 80s and when I was reading it in the 90s, right? When I didn't have the internet to just go and like click on. I mean, we didn't. I mean, I'm sure people had the internet, but we didn't have it in my house, okay? So it was like, go pull an encyclopedia or go to the library or something, right? Or we had this giant Webster's Dictionary, like the old school Webster's Dictionary that was like literally that thick, right? Like literally it was that thick, and it was all like onion skin pages, right? Just every word they could put in there. And it's like, well, what does this word mean? Okay, I got one line. It's like, okay, all right, that's what that is. So just have fun with it. Just do what you want to do. If you don't feel like doing it, don't do it. Third one is going to seem a little silly, but honestly, don't tell anyone that you're reading it. Especially don't tell anybody who has read the book that you're reading it. Listen, there's a very dedicated and excited community around this book, and if you tell someone who's read it that you're reading it, they're going to want to tell you something and they're going to mess it up. It's the same for me. I mean, I'm doing my best to hold back, okay? It's not easy. Don't tell anybody, okay? My sister, my youngest sister, recently told me that she had not read it and she's going to read it. And I said, well, what do you know about the story? What do you know about the book? She's like, nothing. I said, ooh, cool. I said, okay, don't tell anybody that you're going to read it. Don't tell anybody. Just read it in a complete vacuum if you're able to. I'm like, you need to be like Frodo.
Keep it secret. Keep it safe.
And after your initial reading, then you can talk about it and you can sort of form your opinions and your thoughts about things without someone else imprinting their ideas and thoughts on you. And then you have all this energy, but it's not your energy, okay? Because this book is a game, and part of the game is a puzzle. And you wouldn't sit down to a crossword puzzle or a Sudoku with the answers right next to you so you can just fill them in. That's not how that works. You do your best, and then when you get stuck, you think, okay, that's the one. All right. Don't let somebody take that away from you. They won't want to do it maliciously. You just can't help it. You get excited about something like this, and you're going to just start to talk about it. So just keep it on the down low, all right? Okay? You will probably not regret that. So if you haven't read this book, you can just stop right now. You can opt out and just go and read the book and enjoy it and develop thoughts on it, and that's it. If you're not sure, you want to keep watching, sure, go ahead. Whenever I can understand that I'm going to start spoiling things, I'll stop and say, this is it. This is the point where you're going to have to get off the train. I value your experience more than I value my views, which I guess makes it an okay time for me to say, if you enjoy this video, like and subscribe and all those things. Done. A very important note, something I noticed when I recently read this. I did the audiobook because I could take lots of notes and it was easy for me to do it on the run, on the run basically. I noticed that there was zero reading of the appendix in the audiobook. And I'm going to tell you that's a huge mistake. I don't know why that happened. So I'm going to actually read it for anybody who happens to do the audiobook so that you can just have it here to know what the appendix is telling you in advance. I don't think it hurts anything. I think it kind of puts a nice element on it. And honestly, the significance of it may not even occur to you until the end anyways. There's a lot of ambivalent energy about this book where people feel like, I don't get it. You'll come across these bits of information. You learn things too early, or you learn things incompletely. You don't really understand where you are, what's going on. There's a dreamlike quality. I want you to think about this book as being a Metroidvania, a type of video game that uses elements from Castlevania and Metroid, where you would encounter blocked paths. You cannot continue in this direction anymore, and you have to find another way. And you'll find another blocked path. And you'll keep going, and you'll find a door you can open, and there'll be a key. That key will unlock a door previously found that was locked. And then you can follow that door and get another key. You find more locked doors. And this process of finding locked doors, finding a key to a locked door is exactly the experience that you'll probably have with the Book of the New Sun. Constantly running into roadblocks and just not really sure what to do with the information you're given. You don't really understand how to interpret this, or you're not really certain what the hell's going on. Part of the game is reading this book and having these mysteries that seem impenetrable. And at the end of the book, you feel like you have keys you didn't use, and you remember that those doors were very far back in the narrative. The idea is in that second read that you'll be able to unlock more of those doors, and that you'll get more keys. You'll get deeper into the book and still sort of be a little nebulous, and then maybe a third read, and maybe a fourth read. And maybe it keeps going on. I said in that really brief sort of response to Chris's video that I like the confused part, right? I like being confused by this book. And what I mean by that, which I was holding myself back from saying, is that means there's more game to play. There is a sort of energy of like, I don't know if I want to know all of it. I kind of like the idea that there's some of it that I have to keep working on, that it's a task that maybe doesn't have a finite end. If you realize that this is a game you're sitting down to play with Gene Wolfe, that he is inviting you every time you sit down with this book to play a game with him, it makes it really fun and exciting. The appendix. The appendix from Shadow the Torturer, which I mistitled in that short video as the appendix for Claw the Conciliator, the second book in the series. I'm sorry about that, but this appendix is important. It's like somebody doing the audiobook misses a whole aspect of the story. It's very, I don't know why that decision was made. It's a real mistake, but here it is. So, the appendix, a note on translation. In rendering this book, originally composed in a tongue that has not yet achieved existence, into English, I might easily have saved myself a great deal of labor by having recourse to invented terms. In no case have I done so. Thus, in many instances, I have been forced to replace undiscovered concepts by their closest 20th century equivalents, such words as Pellist, androgynon, and exultant are substitutions of this kind, and are intended to be suggestive rather than definitive. Metal is usually, but not always, employed to designate a substance of the sort the word suggests to contemporary minds. When the manuscript makes reference to animal species resulting from biogenetic manipulation or the transportation of extrasolar breeding stock, the name of a similar extinct species has been freely substituted. Indeed, Severian sometimes seems to assume that an extinct species has been restored. The nature of writing and draft animals employed is frequently unclear in the original text. I have scrupled to call these creatures horses, since I am certain the word is not strictly correct. The destriers of the Book of the New Sun are unquestionably swifter and more enduring animals than those we know, and the speed of those used for military purposes seems to permit the delivery of cavalry charges against enemies supported by a high-energy armament. Latin is once or twice employed to indicate that inscriptions and the like are in a language Severian appears to consider obsolete. What the actual language may have been, I cannot say. To those who have preceded me in the study of the prehistoric world, and particularly to those collectors too numerous to name here, who have permitted me to examine artifacts surviving so many centuries of futurity, and most especially to those who have allowed me to visit and photograph the era's few extant buildings, I am truly grateful. G.W. From here on out, the spoilers may start to appear, so tread carefully. If you talk about Gene Wolfe's writing, if you talk about the Book of the New Sun, someone's going to say the words unreliable narrator. And whenever an unreliable narrator becomes involved, you, the reader, become involved. Normally, we intrinsically trust the narrator to tell us a factual truth about the world they exist in. I went to the store and bought an apple, or John's reviews are a chaotic mess. These statements and value judgments are taken as fact. They're what we, if we were the narrator, would say and think in this world. Maybe we don't agree with them, but we understand that in the mind space that this story happens in, that these things are true. In the world of the story, I really did go to the store and get an apple, and John's reviews are really a chaotic mess. What an unreliable narrator says is that the information in those statements is, to some degree, subjective. It doesn't mean that everything's up in the air, but it means that the narrator may not be telling us exactly what happened, exactly how it happened. Most commonly, this is a lie. I didn't actually go to the store, we already had an apple. Or an omission. I used the excuse of going to the store to dispose of evidence that would convict me. But it might be more useful to think of an unreliable narrator as a person who has wants, needs, grievances, and biases that inform how they present the story to you, how they decide to change from the facts to what they tell you. John owes me money, so I'm going to slander him at every chance until I get paid. An unreliable narrator in a story invites us to play a game of discovery with them, to try and figure out what part of their statements are not exactly correct. It may not be a conscious effort on the narrator's part to be unreliable. It could simply be that narrator's perspective and personality and chemistry or just experience, place and time, whatever, that make what they say not quite match up with our expectations. Maybe they think of all fruit as being apples, and really they brought home a pear. Or maybe they think of the fruit stand that's at the corner of the street as a store. I think Severian is this last one. It's his perspective. Severian tells us very early that he has a perfect and excellent memory. He can remember everything. Sort of sends off warning signals when somebody, especially in a book like this, when the narrator says, oh, this is 100% accurate, trust me, right? Okay, sure. And Severian says later in the book that it's hard for him to understand someone who doesn't have a perfect memory. Well, that absolutely informs how he talks to us. He has a hard time understanding that we can't remember perfectly something he told us a chapter ago, 2 chapters ago, maybe even, in the case of some of the later books, a whole book ago. You are not the same as Severian, but he just doesn't remember that. It doesn't occur to him. He has a hard time fathoming the idea of forgetting. Now, he could also be playing an angle there. Something else that could be going on, something that we learn about Severian, where he says that he is an autarch. I know somewhere past halfway, he talks about writing his memoirs, and he's talking about previous autarchs, but he never actually perfectly says that I am an autarch until much later. He is an autarch. He is the ruler, and he's writing his history down. It makes me think of Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar, before the infamous incident of backstabbing, had a campaign where he went and fought the Celts, and he wrote some memoirs. In fact, most of what we know about the Celts comes from Caesar's writings, the person who was fighting them. Those memoirs are propaganda for, you guessed it, Caesar. He wants to make himself look good. Caesar's discussion of the Celts is very tailored. I'm not certain that Severian does it. I think it's something to remember, is that this is somebody who is writing for posterity. And in fact, as the appendix says, he's not even writing for us. This book is a translated work. Supposedly, Gene Wolfe discovered this book and translated it into English. The people that Severian is writing for are people of his own time. They'll probably know who he is. I don't think he's exactly withholding it from us. He's just sort of like, oh, you're reading the memoirs of the autarch? Well, guess what? The autarch was the autarch, right? That's kind of how that goes. It's not really something he comes out and feels he has to say right at the beginning, because you should already know that. And I think that is another part of how this story is unreliable, because we're not the intended audience. I really feel as though those things together are kind of important in how you look at the story. They sort of explain why there's weird things happening, and it's just not very easy to figure out what's going on. And then he doesn't explain it, because Severian isn't trying to build a world for us, even though that's what he ends up doing. He is world building, but it's a very sort of strange and sort of sideways way to do world building, right? You have to sort of discover what's happening by Severian talking about it, and eventually you can put these disparate pieces of the world together to say, oh, I see how this works, just like you do to figure out that Severian is an autarch. When he finally does sort of say, I'm an autarch, you already sort of knew it, but he hadn't really come out and said it yet. And it's sort of a bizarre thing, because I think he says it, I wish I had looked it up, but I think he says it near the end of this first book. Maybe in the last quarter or so, he says it. He actually says, I think, I'm an autarch, or I'm one of the autarchs or something. But you sort of got that impression early, but you just weren't sure. And that's a really good example of you getting information and you just don't really know if it's true or not. You don't really know what to do with it. It's not so much that Severian lies to us, although I'm not saying he doesn't, but it's more that his perception of his world, one, is of someone who lives in the world and we don't, and also of one who can't imagine that we don't remember every single thing and word that he said to us, no matter how briefly. So let's talk about the writing and the language of the book. Specifically, I want to talk about the writing. Most people who read this have that feeling of confusion. Like I said, that's a very common thing. And it took me a little while to figure out why that is. Why are we feeling confused when we read this book? What's happening? And I think it's because Gene Wolfe doesn't necessarily do a lot of describing things. He uses anecdotes and shaggy dog stories to describe something instead of just saying what this thing is like. Now, a shaggy dog story, if you don't know, is just sort of like going a long way around to tell a very simple thing. And there's a lot of that. The shaggy dog story that I normally know is the one that I always think of when I think of what is a shaggy dog story. Is this joke, right, where it's about this this knight who's a member of King Arthur's court, and he's going to go to the meeting of the Round Table, and he has to get there. There's going to be a meeting the next day, and he's riding, and this terrible storm comes, and he's riding through the night. Well, his horse falls and breaks a leg and is unrideable, and he thinks, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make it to the Round Table the next day. What am I going to do? Well, he sees a farm and says, well, maybe there's some sort of a farm animal that I can ride to make it to that meeting tomorrow. So he goes into the barn and he looks around, and there's really nothing in there except this dog, this huge dog. And he thinks, oh man, that dog is big enough. I could ride this dog. And I could make it to King Arthur's court, make it to the meeting of the Round Table tomorrow on the back of this dog. I can do this. And so he wakes up the farmer and he brings him out to the barn and says, listen, I've got to go to King Arthur's court tomorrow. I have this important meeting with the Round Table. I lost my horse. It's lame. I can't ride it. I need to get there. Your dog is big enough. Can I ride your dog? And the farmer stops and he looks at the night and he looks outside at the rain and the storm and he says, I can't send a knight out on a dog like this. That's a Shaggy Dog story and a bad joke. Gene Wolfe will not say something is red. He'll say, I remember my mother telling me a story about when she was a kid, she painted this stained glass and they hung it from this tree and the red light would shine on the ground and made the ground look, this green grass look like it was on fire. And that was the color of his cloak. And it's stuff like that, these sort of very long roundabout ways to tell you something. And it requires a lot of processing power, mental processing power sometimes to read a section or a paragraph, because there's so much of this like thing happening that you maybe don't, that you can tell there's deeper meanings in, but you're not quite certain. Anecdotes, and then sort of unexpected revelations all happening. It's kind of like when you're working on your computer and you're doing something, you've got a couple windows open and all of a sudden the fan kicks on and high and your computer starts to whine a little bit. It's like that. This whole book is like the fan kicking on. There's definitely a sense of that. Like, okay, sure. Okay, what just happened? There's a lot of things that just happened in this, like these 2 paragraphs. And that's where people say this book is dense, and it is dense. But that's kind of why. And I think that on rereads, it can really, it can be a really enjoyable experience to go back and reread it and see those things and see what's happening and sort of think, oh, okay, I get it. I see what you're doing. But also those anecdotes, those Shaggy Dog stories are a good way that Wolfe uses to do the world building. That's how we get information about the sort of weird sort of religion that people worship. And when Wolfe uses this archaic language to describe something, a destrier, for example, then you as the reader have to interpret that word, that noun, that adjective, whatever it is. You have to make a decision about what that means. And that interpretation of that word can have 3 meanings. Chris, I believe it was in his deep reading, just talked about the key in this book, the key to understanding it. It's an extremely important part of the book and probably an important part for the rest of the series. I just feel that I need to read it to you again to make sure that for myself, to make sure that I'm on target as I continue my talk, because this is a little bit ad-lib from here on out. My notes ended a few minutes ago. And also to make sure that you know what I'm trying to say and that I get this stuff right. So let me do a brief reading of that section. The Brown Book is a collection of the myths of the past and its section listing all the keys of the universe. One of these keys was that everything, whatever happens, has 3 meanings. The first is its practical meaning, what the book calls the thing the plowman sees. The cow has taken a mouthful of grass, and it is real grass and a real cow. That meaning is as important and as true as either of the others. The second is that the reflection of the world around it. Every object is in contact with all others, and thus the wise can learn of the others by observing the first. That might be called the soothsayer's meaning, because it is one such people use when they prophesy a fortunate meeting from the tracks of a serpent, or confirm the outcome of a love affair by putting the elector of one suit atop the patroness of another. And the third meaning, Dorcas asked. The third is the transubstantial meaning. Since all objects have their ultimate origin in the Pancreator and all were set in motion by him, so all must express his will, which is higher reality. Then Dorcas said, It seems to me that if what Chatelaine Thecla's book says is true, then people have everything backward. I could see the glimmer of her pale hair in the moonlight. It seems to me what you call the third meaning is very clear, but the second meaning is harder to find, and the first, which ought to be the easiest, is impossible. It's essentially Gene Wolfe telling us how we can interpret these things in this book. There's three ways to look at this interpretation. It says at first that it's ascending order, that one is easiest. What something is should be easy. And then sort of like what a soothsayer says something is a little harder. And then what the transubstantial is seems almost impossible. What is this? It's an apple. That seems easy. What does the apple mean? Well, this apple has got a little bruise in it, and that bruise could symbolize this character feeling emotionally bruised because of something that had just happened, or just in general, that's his personality. Okay, and the transubstantial would mean, like, well, what does the apple symbolize to God? And you could say something about original sin and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? That's one very lazy sort of interpretation of those things. But Dorcas says actually it's the reverse. The third one should be easy and the first one hard. So here's what I think. The transubstantial interpretation is infinitely subjective. It's anytime we as human beings think about something, we put all our experiences, all of our knowledge, our biochemistry, the way that our minds work because of whatever unique things we've been eating today and just in general our genetics, all play into what we think about something, whether we like that or not. It all does. It all affects the machine, and then that affects the ultimate output of what we think about something. Infinitely subjective. There will never be another person like you, ever. You are absolutely unique. Even if you were cloned, you would be unique because no clone could have all your experiences. Just couldn't. At least as far as I know. At least not with today's technology, okay? This apple and what this apple is for you and how you interpret that apple as it relates to God and God himself, for all your own or lack of God or whatever, whether you're an atheist or a theist, it doesn't matter. You're going to have a unique interpretation of that symbol, of that thing. Alternately, what is an apple actually is impossible to define. What is this apple? It's impossible to define what atoms are in this apple, what their electron charges are, and where it's moving in our solar system as the planet spins and orbits the sun, and our sun orbits the galaxy, and the galaxy orbits the megacluster, and all these other things are all information that's in this apple to define it. It's infinitely objective. And we are finite beings. We have limited capacity to understand something. We could never understand intrinsically what an apple truly, actually, physically is. It's just too much information, even though we will try to figure out what's impossible, right? Even though we work at it. The soothsayer's meaning is a blending of those two, right? It's applying the subjective and the objective together. And that one I think is difficult to kind of figure out like a good example for, but I think that's what's going on. So I think it's when she says it's easy to do the transubstantial definition is because it's easy. That's what comes natural. That's what you immediately think of. The thing that you think of when you think of an apple, that is the transubstantial meaning. Whatever it is that you think of, that is your unique interpretation. Right? What you think this apple means as it relates to the real world is how you use the second interpretation. And what it actually is We try to say, well, it's just an apple. I mean, come on, man. But of course, it's much more than just an apple, because you could point at numerous things and say, these are all just apples too, but they're all not that apple. What is that specific, exact, precise apple? It's too much information. You can't, it's too much to collect. At least, I mean, I know that maybe I'm getting a little deep on it, but you see what I'm trying to say. I think that's where Dorcas was heading with that. Your interpretation of that symbol has three possibilities, okay? It has the transubstantial, it has the soothsayers, and it has the plowmans. And that means that you can keep revisiting it, and your interpretation is going to change as your own life experiences change. As you grow older and your experiences change and mature, you'll interpret some of the symbols differently. You'll look at the book differently and apply different results to the book. And you'll still work for these absolute definitions, for these soothsayers definitions, and for these subjective transubstantial I don't want to say transcendental, and that's not right. Transubstantial definitions. You know, a lot of times with books like this that are really well loved, people go back and read them over and over again. And I think that there's a certain degree of like the amount of work that a writer has put into something is how much somebody can get out of it. And I think that's maybe to some extent why Lord of the Rings is so rereadable and why people love it and keep revisiting it, even though it doesn't do anything particularly insane or complex. There's a depth there that can be felt. The work that Tolkien did on that book can be felt. And I think there's the same thing here, except the difference is with the Book of the New Sun is that it uses you as a battery. There's so many subjective opportunities, although I feel like most of us would come to similar conclusions. There's so many subjective opportunities here that the book becomes a unique experience that is completely and wholly yours. I think that's why I love it. I didn't really think about these things until I started to reread this, and I thought, that is sort of what's happening. You are the power source for the energy of this book. And so when you read it, you're playing a game that I think might be infinitely replayable. And has these mysteries that you can just plumb over and over again and find rewarding. It was meant to be reread. It was meant to be replayed. And I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of amazing, actually. I don't honestly know of any other book that does what this book does. It's sort of a game that you play and you don't even know that you're playing a game. And I think maybe one of the keys is to know that it is a game. We're just going to, whatever comes to the top of my head. This is the appendix. Yeah, so all these words that Wolfe uses in this book are interpreted. You can interpret these words however you, well, I mean, you could interpret them however you want, but it's sort of like uniquely how you decide to look them up and what it means. And maybe you don't even look the word up. Maybe you assume what that word is and you run with that. And honestly, I'm going to tell you something. I don't know if I get flack for this or not. I think that's a valid response. I think it's a valid response. I mean, the book is even saying in the appendix that these are not quite the right word. So if it says autarch and you have a particular idea about what an autarch is, you don't have to look it up. That can be what an autarch is. This is your book. Enjoy it. One quote that you'll see about Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun and Gene Wolfe himself, specifically Gene Wolfe himself, is by Ursula K. Le Guin, where she says that Gene Wolfe is our own homegrown Borges. And Borges, I do feel like, has some relation to Wolfe here. I think that there's some Borges in this book to some extent, to a decent extent, actually. I've read a little bit of Borges, but I'm not well read in Borges. I do want to bring up a discussion that I'm going to tell you, I feel like I'm in a little bit in kind of deep water when I start talking about it, because I haven't read a lot of Borges, and the discussion about this is newish to me. It's not something I have like completely internalized and worked through. So that's why it's in the appendix. Okay. I'm just sort of voicing it and just sort of see what happens. And Borges wrote a lot of stuff, to my knowledge. He wrote a lot about this sort of comparison of realism and idealism. And realism being interpreting the world using your senses, your sense of taste and your sight and your hearing and touch, all those, and interpreting the world. And then when those senses come up short, using observation and repeatability of testing to determine things like at a microscopic level or a macro level like space. And idealism says you can't understand this sort of a higher or a lower existence than ours with your senses. It takes something other than that. It takes sort of sideways thinking or an undiscovered sense or something to interact with, right? Normally realism is sort of attributed to being scientific, and idealism is being spiritual or religious. You cannot detect God, but you intrinsically believe in God and act and go through rituals to interact with this existence that is not, that you can't prove or identify with your senses. And that's what realism and idealism is. I do think there's some things going on here with that. But I'm going to back away. I'm just going to say that and leave it because, again, I'm very new to that. Those concepts, as Borges writes them, and maybe as they're applying in the book. So I don't really know that I don't feel as though I have the information to talk at length about them, and without just sort of randomly firing in the dark. And I don't exactly want to start tearing apart symbolism in this book. But I am going to do something. This is, again, as a companion video to Chris. He talks about the mirror scene. And in that scene, a character is taken into this room where these mirrors are put together. And they're at certain angles that allows light, if light is completely purified, the mirrors are completely pure, light can be shown back and forth in the mirrors and reflect itself faster than the speed of light, right? Light moving faster than the speed of light. And when that happens, it can't stay in our universe anymore because it has to go to a different dimension where the speed of light is higher. You can get a reflection of something, but if there's a reflection in the mirror of something that doesn't exist, it will bring something into existence. So this light bounces back and forth and the light exits, but there's still a reflection of something, and that this reflection can be made real, and that this idea is how their space travel works. There's a lot of talk and shadow about light. It's in the title, Shadow of the Torturer. I think it's interesting. We talk about light moving faster. What about when light moves slower, right? What about when light was slowed down? Does it enter a lower dimension then? Severian wears a fulgen cloak, which is blacker than black. Black absorbs light. When light strikes Severian's cloak, does it enter a lower dimension? Makes me think, when I think of a lower dimension, I think of the underworld or the afterlife. Severian is multiple times, I think at least 3 times, expressly identified as death in this book. I think in a sense being sort of like a shepherd for death, right? That is sort of the role of the torturers, being these shepherds of death. Anytime light gets mentioned in here, in this book, I just think, like, how does that relate to this mirror scene? And I think it was great that Chris brought it up, because it did sort of give me a leg up in this reread to sort of really look at any time light is brought up or darkness, and to really think about that. And there's so much more to talk about in this book. It's like an insane amount. I mean, I made more notes for this book. First of all, I don't even normally make notes. I have so many notes that I really have to go and get some sort of a book or a notebook or something and actually transcribe all the notes that I took out. I just took out a lot of it is like, sort of a synopsis of what a scene was and what happened so I can remember later. But there's just I'm just saying these things and I can think of like 10 other things. I'm like, well, what about this? But I'm like, now I'm just going through everything and just talking about everything. And I don't really know that I want to do that right. I mean, I do want to do it, but I would like to, maybe I should save it. So again, thanks to Chris Liminal Spaces for his really great reviews and coverage of this book, and to inspire me to go back and reread and rediscover something that I just love, and to put a whole nother angle on it. And it was just a wonderful experience. My name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books. If you've enjoyed this, if you found any value in this, a like is appreciated, and subscribe if you'd like to see me do more of this. That's all I've got. Bye.